Gabriel Montenegro was never one to act on impulse. At 52, with his hair meticulously combed to the side and an expression that seemed permanently calculated, he lived anchored in spreadsheets, forecasts, and quarterly reports. Owner of a network of commercial properties across Europe, he managed everything from a distance, with the coldness of someone who trusts numbers more than people. That Tuesday in March, while sipping his black coffee without sugar in his glass-walled office in Madrid, he received yet another notification. The rent for the sewing shop in Seville was 4 months overdue. His assistants suggested legal action, as usual, but Gabriel, unable to explain why, said he would handle it himself. He got into his car, refused the driver, and set off for Seville as if something were pulling him. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find real or fact-inspired stories that truly move us. He arrived in the late afternoon when the sun still cast long shadows across the narrow sidewalks of the old quarter. The shop's facade was discreet, with a faded sign and dusty display windows. There was no movement, only a metallic hum coming from inside. Gabriel pushed open the door, which creaked as if warning someone. The smell of old fabric and machine oil filled the air. At the back of the room, half hidden among piles of scraps and empty hangers, a frail little girl was operating a manual sewing machine with mechanical movements. Her brown hair was tied up haphazardly, and her injured, dirty fingers slid over the needle with a sad precision. She didn't lift her eyes. Gabriel stopped. None of this made sense. Nothing there seemed right. Gabriel stood frozen for a few seconds on the threshold. The sound of the machine was hypnotic and, at the same time, disturbing, like a repetitive warning that this shouldn't be happening. He took a few slow steps forward until the girl, sensing his presence, stopped sewing. Only then did she lift her face, expressionless. Her dull brown eyes showed neither fear nor curiosity, only a disquieting emptiness, as if she were there, but not really there. Gabriel stepped closer and knelt down slowly, unsure what to say. She watched him in silence, her fingers still pressing the fabric, as if she didn't know whether to continue or stop altogether. Before he could speak, a sharp voice interrupted the moment. "Ah, Mr. Montenegro, what a pleasant surprise." It was Aurora Vasquez, a woman of about 45, with platinum blonde dyed hair and a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. She wore a colorful floral print smock and high heels that looked uncomfortable even to stand in. She emerged from the back of the shop as though expecting a visitor, but annoyed to have been caught off guard. In seconds, she placed herself between Gabriel and the girl, looping an arm around the child as if in an affectionate gesture. "This is Marina, my niece, an artist since she was little. She loves playing at sewing. A real talent, isn't she?" she said, laughing exaggeratedly, as though trying too hard to seem spontaneous. Gabriel didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the girl's injured fingers, and the child now seemed to have shrunk into herself. Gabriel wasn't a child specialist, but he knew when something was wrong, and nothing about this girl resembled an innocent game. Her hands were marked, her eyes looked accustomed to fatigue, and around the machine were scraps of fabric, as though this were routine, not a hobby. Aurora jabbered on, trying to ease the embarrassment. She spoke about the shop, the difficulties during the pandemic, the longing for her sister, the girl's mother, who had died 2 years earlier. It was a tragedy, really. A horrible car accident. "Since then, I'm all this little girl has in the world," she said with a practiced expression of contained grief. Gabriel nodded, but nothing she said matched the scene before him. The shop seemed abandoned, but not in the sense of disuse. There were signs of recent occupation, food wrappers on the counter, an improvised quilt folded atop an old couch in the back. He asked to see the lease contract, trying to keep the conversation professional. Aurora hurried to fetch a folder of documents, but did so with noticeable anxiety. With each question, she averted her eyes slightly, as if calculating her answers. She said she was waiting for a transfer from abroad, that everything would be resolved soon, that Gabriel needn't worry. He examined the papers, but his mind was elsewhere. Marina, now half hidden behind a fabric screen, clutched a dingy stuffed bear by its ear as if it were the only piece of childhood she had left. Without fully understanding his own feelings, Gabriel politely excused himself and left the shop with the promise to return soon. But deep down, he already knew he would come back not for the overdue rent, but for the uncomfortable sensation that visit had left in his chest. That night, Gabriel couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his hotel bed, plagued by a kind of anguish he couldn't name. He was used to solving practical problems, delinquency, poorly drafted contracts, emergency renovations. But this wasn't practical. It was far too human. The image of the girl bent over the machine, her injured fingers, the look that neither asked for help nor knew how to refuse, it hammered in his mind more insistently than any red number in his monthly reports. For the first time in a long while, he felt that sending someone else to handle it wouldn't suffice. He needed to understand what was really happening. He needed to see with his own eyes. The next day, instead of returning to Madrid, he decided to extend his stay. He cancelled meetings, turned off his phone, and told his secretary only that he would be unavailable. He started with the basics. He used his trusted lawyer, Rafael Santamaria, to pull up records on the shop, the woman, and the child. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Aurora was listed as Marina's legal guardian, but the document was old, informal, a declaration made at the local notary's office after the mother's death. There was no formal court-appointed guardianship. That alone was a red flag. Gabriel went to the neighborhood public school, pretending to be a distant relative. There he learned that Marina hadn't attended classes since her mother's death. She disappeared from the system. Her aunt said they were traveling. A staff member confided, lowering her voice as though she'd long suspected something, but didn't know whom to tell. Gabriel noted every detail. Each piece felt like part of a larger puzzle. And the more he investigated, the more he sensed he was facing something carefully hidden, like an old wound covered by a fresh bandage. His next stop was the shop's neighborhood. Gabriel spent the morning walking the narrow streets of Seville, chatting with shopkeepers and residents, always with the same casual approach, saying he was the property owner doing an area evaluation. Some recognized him, others didn't, but all seemed to know Aurora. "She's kind of strange, always changing her story about the girl," said the bakery owner next door as she pulled bread from the oven. An elderly man selling religious articles remarked that he almost never saw the child outside the shop. "When I do, she's always carrying bags or pushing that clothing rack. I've never seen her smile." Each conversation added another layer to Gabriel's unease. The image of Aurora as a loving caregiver crumbled quickly. There was a coldness in the accounts, as if the woman operated on the edge between the unseen and the feared, known enough to be noticed, yet distant enough that no one dared intervene. If this story is gripping you, like the video to support our work and help spread narratives that deserve to be heard. That same day, Gabriel received a call from Rafael. The lawyer's voice was tense, but controlled. "You won't believe what I found." Over the next few hours, Rafael dug through financial records left by Marina's mother. He discovered she had owned a small artisanal goods business that, despite its low profile, had quietly grown with overseas sales. Shortly before she died, she had transferred a considerable sum into an account in her daughter's name, a legacy that should have been managed by a legal guardian. "Guess who's been moving that account regularly?" Rafael asked. The answer was obvious: Aurora. But the most alarming part was that everything was done under the guise of legitimate documents. Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. Now, it wasn't just about neglect or mistreatment. It was about conscious exploitation and a scheme sustained by the omission of many. In the days that followed, Gabriel plunged headfirst into the investigation, as if his mind needed answers to justify the discomfort he'd felt since first seeing Marina. He discreetly hired a retired social worker, a contact of Raphael's, to help him understand the legal avenues for a possible complaint. But every time they contacted the authorities, the response was the same. The documentation is in order. When they tried to dig deeper, officials became evasive or deflected. Then an unexpected lead emerged, a woman who had worked for Aurora and upon learning of the financial transactions, reached out to Raphael asking to speak in person. The meeting was set for a discreet cafe on a rainy late afternoon, and Gabriel insisted on going. Lucia Ortega was a small woman with rapid speech and restless hands. Her eyes were sharp, as though she had learned to distrust everything, and she gripped a folder so tightly it seemed she feared it would be snatched away. She said she had worked with Aurora for almost a year, handling the shop's behind-the-scenes tasks. Marina never played in there. She worked every day without rest. According to Lucia, the girl sewed pieces for small local brands, sold at fairs and events, all off the books. Aurora used forged documents, enlisted a corrupt accountant, and in exchange for favors, kept some Child Protection Council members under her thumb. She doesn't shout, she doesn't hit, but she humiliates, isolates, threatens. Lucia recounted that once she tried to report it, but received an anonymous letter with veiled threats. Since then, she'd kept quiet, until she saw someone finally willing to confront Aurora. At the end of their conversation, she handed Gabriel the folder. Inside were photos, time logs, handwritten spreadsheets, even hidden recordings. It was what he needed, but it was also confirmation of the worst. That night, Gabriel spent hours reviewing the documents and listening to the audio files Lucia had provided. Images of Marina hauling heavy bags, sewing for hours on end, being reprimanded with cold, threatening words, filled his laptop screen in silence, as if screaming for justice. With each click, something inside him. It clenched. It wasn't just indignation. It was a kind of internal pain, as though he were forced to face a part of the world he had long avoided. He realized he had always lived behind walls of efficiency and control. His world was predictable, safe, built on contracts and targets. But now, faced with Marina's reality, everything felt small. For the first time in a long time, he felt personally responsible for something beyond his company or his assets. This was human and urgent. The next morning, he and Raphael gathered all the material and filed a formal complaint with the public prosecutor's office. But the initial enthusiasm quickly dissipated. Even with conclusive evidence, the case moved at a glacial pace. Authorities claimed additional verifications were needed, that the complaint had to be forwarded to the correct department. Meanwhile, Marina remained trapped in the shop, bound to its silent routine and Aurora's watchful eyes. Gabriel began to lose patience. He called daily. He applied pressure, insisted. He was ignored, stonewalled, even advised to wait. Then Raphael, one exhausted afternoon, slammed his pen on the table and said, "We need another approach. If she's planning to flee with the girl, we have to act first." At that point, Lucia got back in touch. She'd heard rumors. Aurora was planning a trip out of Spain to a country with no extradition treaty, and Marina was going with her. The news struck like lightning. Gabriel dropped everything and rushed to Raphael's office. "We have days, maybe hours. If she crosses the border, goodbye, Marina." The tension in the air was palpable. Raphael began making calls, contacting allies in the judiciary and the national police. A trusted judge who had worked on sensitive child guardianship cases agreed to help, but said they needed a flagrante delicto. "If we catch her in the act of fleeing, I can issue a preventive arrest warrant," she explained. From there, an improvised operation began. Lucia was tasked with discreetly surveilling the shop, watching for any unusual activity. Gabriel hired a reliable driver to keep a car running and on standby, and he himself decided to oversee everything up close, checking into a small hotel across the street, where he had a direct view of the shop's front door. 2 days passed with no news, and exhaustion set in. Gabriel barely ate, barely slept, spending nights analyzing every person who entered or exited the street. On the third day, at 6:40 a.m., The hotel. Doorbell rang. It was Lucia, breathless, her face flushed and eyes wide. She left with the girl. She has 2 small suitcases and just hailed a taxi. Gabriel leapt from the bed, threw on clothes from a chair and ran for the car. Raphael was already in contact with the judge, who promised to send the warrant by email to the station's officers. Everything had to happen immediately. The driver tailed the taxi at a safe distance, while Gabriel, in the back seat, tried to steady his breathing. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do with the fear of losing someone. The train station was crowded. It was a cold morning, with low clouds and a light mist that made everything feel slower, heavier. Gabriel and Raphael got out of the car and positioned themselves near the main entrance, while 2 plainclothes officers slipped among the passengers. Lucia had managed to send recent photos of Aurora and Marina, which made identification easier. Within minutes, Raphael spotted them. Aurora hurried along platform 3, dragging a blue suitcase and gripping Marina's wrist. The girl walked with her head down, her steps short and quick, as if she didn't want to delay whatever was coming. Gabriel felt an uncontrollable urge to run to them, but Raphael held him back. "Calm down. If you approach now, she could react and escape. Wait for the officers." The seconds that followed felt like hours. Everything around him vanished. Voices, announcements, footsteps. Only that scene existed. When the officers finally reached Aurora and announced her detention, the woman feigned surprise. "This is absurd. I have legal custody." But her expression wasn't one of shock. It was one of calculation. Gabriel saw in her eyes that she had anticipated this possibility. She just hadn't expected anyone to act. Marina froze, not quite understanding what was happening. When Aurora tried to pull her back, one of the officers stopped her, and at that moment something changed. Marina took 2 steps back as if coming out of a trance. Her eyes searched for someone and found Gabriel's. For the first time there was a silent exchange, a recognition, a spark of trust, and with a trembling but firm voice she said, "She lied, she hurt me, I don't want to go with her." Marina's brief testimony carried the weight of a verdict. The officers confirmed the warrant and placed Aurora in custody immediately. She tried to protest, threatened lawyers, but was ignored. Meanwhile, the girl remained motionless, arms at her sides, eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to grasp whether this was real. Gabriel approached slowly, knelt to her level, and whispered, "It's okay, Marina. Do you want to come with me?" She hesitated for a few seconds, glanced at the suitcase on the ground, at where Aurora had been taken, then at his eyes. Finally, she nodded almost imperceptibly. Gabriel extended his hand, and with a timid gesture she took it. Her hands were small and rough, but in that moment the touch was a silent pact, a beginning. At the station, while Raphael handled the legal formalities, Gabriel stayed by the girl's side, sitting on a wooden bench against the wall. Marina didn't speak much. She just watched. Her eyes roamed the room attentively, but without fear, as though learning to breathe again in a place where she wouldn't be punished for mistakes. A social worker was called to accompany her, but Marina refused to. Let go of Gabriel's hand. When they tried to take her to a separate room, she shook her head. "She stays with me," Gabriel said firmly but without raising his voice. The unplanned declaration sounded strangely natural, as if he had already assumed the responsibility, even without knowing what lay ahead. On that day, Gabriel Montenegro, the man of numbers and professional distance, began to be rewritten, not by calculation, but by a choice made in the dark, with his heart. In the weeks that followed, Gabriel entered a completely new world. Initially, Marina's custody was granted provisionally while the legal process continued. He had to present documents, undergo interviews with psychologists, demonstrate that he was prepared, at least on paper, to assume responsibility for a child, but no form could capture what was unfolding between him and Marina. On her first night in his Madrid home, she barely spoke. She chose a corner of the sofa and stayed there, clutching the same worn teddy. bear she'd brought from the sewing shop. Not knowing how to proceed, Gabriel simply draped a blanket over her and left a glass of warm milk on the coffee table. It was all he knew how to do. Yet that night, before turning off the light, he heard a whisper from the sofa. "Good night." It was the first word she'd spoken since the station. He replied with a voice thick with emotion, "Good night, Marina." Living together was challenging but full of small victories. In the first days, she startled at loud noises and looked over her shoulder whenever someone called her name. She was afraid of making mistakes, of asking for anything, even of laughing. But gradually, with Gabriel's respectful silence and the help of a child psychologist specializing in trauma, Marina began to relax. She learned she could choose her own clothes. She could leave food on her plate without punishment. She could play. One day, seeing that Gabriel had returned from the supermarket with a doll among his groceries, she stood before him in silence, stared into his eyes for a few seconds, then ran to her room, hugging the toy as if it were something sacred. Gabriel, sitting on the floor outside her door, wept quietly. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to care for someone beyond himself. Little by little, Gabriel adjusted his routine to accommodate Marina. Things that once seemed non-negotiable, fixed meeting times, weekly reports, absolute silence at home, began to flex. He started researching parenting, reading about childhood trauma, hiring an educator to help her catch up on missed school. He discovered Marina loved to draw, and one afternoon turned one of the house's rooms into an improvised art studio with papers, paints, and colored pencils scattered everywhere. She still spoke little, but her drawings told stories. In one, Gabriel saw something that touched him deeply. A man in a suit holding a girl's hand in front of an open door with blue sky beyond. He didn't ask about it. He simply framed the drawing and hung it in the hallway. It was the first time the house had color. Despite the progress, nightmares were frequent. Marina woke up sweating in the middle of the night, sometimes screaming, sometimes silent, as if trying to erase her own existence. Gabriel, who had never dealt with emotional fragility so up close, learned to recognize the signs. He began sleeping with the door ajar, always alert to the slightest sound. When he heard her get up, he would quietly go to her room, sit beside her, and wait. He never forced conversation. Sometimes she would rest her head on his shoulder. Other times, she would simply hold his hand until she fell back asleep. It wasn't about solving anything. It was about being there, present, available. And he discovered that this had a value no spreadsheet could measure. It was in that shared silence, without promises or pressure, that their trust solidified into something real, alive, and unbreakable. As the months passed, the house changed, and so did Gabriel. What had once been a sterile, almost clinical environment now featured drawings taped to the refrigerator, colorful cushions strewn across the sofa, and timid laughter echoing down the halls. Marina began attending school regularly, made 2 friends, and started talking more, especially about everyday things. Gabriel found himself anxious, waiting to pick her up after class, eager to hear whatever stories she would share in the car, even if they were just about her snack or a game at recess. One day, she burst into the house clutching a crumpled note. She'd been invited to a classmate's birthday party. Gabriel dropped everything. They shopped for a gift together, picked out a dress, and talked about how to behave at parties. That night, when she returned exhausted and happy, he realized that step by step, he was learning to be a father, not out of obligation, but by choice. Still, the legal process continued in parallel, bringing uncertainty. Permanent custody depended on hearings, evaluations, and bureaucracy that seemed out of step with real life. Aurora, even in custody, fought back with an aggressive, influential lawyer. They filed a motion challenging Gabriel's emotional stability, trying to disqualify him as a guardian. It was a blow. He fell silent for days, unsure whether to keep fighting. Then, one afternoon while washing dishes, Marina entered the kitchen, pulled up a chair, and said matter-of-factly, "If the judge asks, I'll say you're my dad, okay?" Gabriel froze, the dishes slipping from his hands, his heart racing. He didn't answer immediately. He knelt, looked into her eyes and said, "That's more than okay." In that moment, he knew there was no turning back, and he wouldn't want there to be. The final hearing took place on a cold November morning. Marina wore a navy blue dress with a golden hair clip, a gift from Gabriel. He was in his usual suit, but his hands trembled slightly. A detail imperceptible to most, but noticed by Marina, who squeezed his hand before they entered the courtroom. The judge, a stern woman with a keen gaze, read the case calmly. Raphael presented the documents, psychological reports, and the social worker's favorable assessment. Aurora sat there with a disdainful expression, trying to argue it was all a misunderstanding. When asked, Marina paused for a few seconds, then looked directly at the judge and said, "With her, I was afraid even to breathe. With him, I can sleep with the door open." Her words filled the room with a heavy silence. There was nothing more to say. That same day, the judge granted Gabriel Montenegro permanent custody. The decision was read aloud, but he barely heard the words. He felt his entire body relax from a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Marina hugged him tightly around the waist, her head resting on his chest, and for the first time he cried in public without caring. Leaving the courthouse, there was no party or grand celebration, just the two of them going to a simple diner for fries and milkshakes. Marina declared it the best day of her life, and Gabriel, between sips, simply smiled, watching her every gesture as if imprinting it in his memory. He knew their journey was only beginning, but that moment marked an end and a beginning, confirmation that they were now a family, not by blood, but by everything that truly matters. After gaining permanent custody, their life settled into a new rhythm. Marina began calling Gabriel Dad more often, though only at home when she felt safe. He respected that, never demanding words or gestures. Their bond was built on consistency, not obligation. They were there for each other. It was in the small routines that their relationship strengthened. Morning coffee with bread and cheese, evenings reading together before bed, moments when Gabriel sat beside her just to watch her draw, saying nothing. Marina's art evolved. Dark, angular figures gave way to soft colors and smiling characters. She drew their home, her school, friends, her toy-filled room. One day, she sketched Gabriel asleep on the sofa with a newspaper on his lap, just as he did on Sundays. When she showed him, she said, "You snore." They laughed together. Yet Marina still carried scars. Sometimes any abrupt change would make her shut down. Certain smells, sounds, or expressions would send her back to the silent, defensive state Gabriel knew so well. A psychologist explained, "Trauma doesn't disappear. It learns to coexist, and together you'll build new memories to balance the old ones." Gabriel took that as a mission. He began documenting happy moments, creating small rituals, Sunday pancake breakfasts, bike rides in the park. There was no formula. Sometimes it worked, sometimes not. But he was there, always. And Marina eventually learned she no longer needed to sleep with her shoes by the bed, as she had in the shop, fearing she might have to run at a moment's notice. Now she slept barefoot, in darkness, the door slightly ajar. A small detail, but immense. One Saturday, while organizing a box of Marina's old drawings, Gabriel found a crumpled sheet marked by forceful scribbles, unlike her other work. In the center was a woman with red eyes, surrounded by phrases like, "Don't speak, don't cry, and stay quiet." He looked at Marina, who was now standing back, choosing which drawings to keep. He thought of hiding the sheet, of letting it go, but he took a deep breath, sat beside her and showed it to her. "Do you want to tell me about this one?" Marina glanced at it, swallowed, and after a few seconds said softly, "It was when she locked me in the shop. I stayed there until I finished everything." Gabriel didn't press for more details. He simply held her tightly for minutes. It wasn't about extracting facts. It was about showing her she wasn't alone anymore. The following week, Marina asked to visit her mother's grave, a request she'd never voiced before, and Gabriel was surprised. They planned the trip carefully, bringing flowers, a letter Marina wrote herself, and a drawing of her and her mother on a beach holding hands. At the cemetery, Marina stood silently before the headstone for long minutes. Then she knelt, placed the items gently, and said, "Now I'm okay. He takes care of me." Gabriel felt tears well up, but honored her moment in silence. As they left, she didn't speak much, but on the drive back, she held his hand tightly. In that gesture were grief, farewell, acceptance, and the certainty that despite not forgetting the past, she was forging her own future, and Gabriel was part of it. Not long after that visit, Marina began showing curiosity about Gabriel's work. She wanted to know what he did when he spent hours in the office, what the numbers meant, and why he always wore such serious clothes. Amused by her interest, Gabriel decided to show her his world differently. One Saturday, he took her to one of his commercial properties, a newly renovated bookstore. He showed her how negotiations worked, the care taken with structural details, decisions about rent and renovation. Marina listened intently and asked unexpected questions. Why does someone pay to stay somewhere that's not theirs? And have you ever made someone sad with a decision? Gabriel paused before answering, "I think I have, but now I try to think more about people, not just numbers." He was honest, because it was true. That outing became a tradition. Marina enjoyed accompanying Gabriel on discreet property visits and would sketch the places. They even made a notebook called Daddy's Places, where she pasted her drawings and wrote brief observations. "This one smells like mildew, but it's pretty. This one has a staircase that creaks funny." Gabriel marveled at her sensitivity. She noticed things he, even with experience, had overlooked. On one such trip, she pointed to an empty warehouse and said, "This could be an art school for kids who don't have pencils at home." Gabriel smiled, but took the idea seriously. He jotted it down, researched, and began imagining the project. It wasn't just about filling empty spaces, it was about transforming them. And in that process, he realized it wasn't only Marina who was growing. He was rebuilding himself step by step alongside her. Months later, Marina was invited to exhibit at her school's art show. Each student could display one piece, and she chose a secret drawing. Two figures sitting on a park bench side by side under an orange sky, with a dog sleeping at their feet. When Gabriel saw it, he recognized it as the exact scene from their first trip to the park months earlier, when a stray dog had dozed beside them. The memory had seemed trivial to him, but to her, it was momentous enough to become art. On exhibition night, Marina was nervous and almost didn't go. But Gabriel calmly encouraged her, promising he would stay by her side. At the event, she clutched his hand tightly, and he understood. This was more than an art show. It was a milestone of triumph. During the reception, parents and teachers praised the students' work. Marina shyly thanked them, but gradually her smile became freer. One teacher, moved to tears, told Gabriel, "She has blossomed in ways no one expected. This girl has a light." He just smiled, unable to say much. On the drive home, Marina sat quietly for a few minutes, staring out the window. Then she spoke softly. "I think Mom would be happy if she saw this." Gabriel gripped the wheel tightly, glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and replied, "I'm sure she would." Marina said nothing more, but stepping out of the car, she ran to him and hugged him around the waist as she hadn't since the hearing. In that tight embrace was everything words could never convey. That same month, Gabriel was invited to give a lecture on social responsibility at a local university. At first, he thought of declining. He wasn't comfortable sharing his personal life publicly. But Marina, upon hearing the invitation, asked, "Are you going to talk about me?" He smiled. "Only if you let me." She replied with bright eyes, "You can. It's a beautiful story." That broke him. On the day of the event, Gabriel donned his best suit but kept Marina's park drawing in his pocket. He stepped onto the stage nervous, yet spoke with a naturalness that surprised even himself. He recounted how visiting an abandoned property changed his life, how a Silent Girl taught him more about humanity than decades of management, and how, instead of saving someone, he had been saved. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment before giving him a standing ovation. Some were moved to tears, others asked questions. A student raised his hand and said, "Mr. Montenegro, what has changed most in you since Marina came into your life?" Gabriel paused, looked at the drawing in his pocket, and answered, "I used to calculate everything. Now I've learned to feel." It was the most honest answer he could give. Returning home that night, he found Marina asleep on the sofa with a book open on her chest. He didn't wake her, he simply covered her with a blanket and sat beside her, watching. In that shared silence, he realized there is no formula for life, no right path, but there are encounters. And theirs, improbable and transformative, was the greatest gift he'd ever received. Weeks later, Gabriel and Marina decided to take a vacation together for the first time since they'd been a family. They chose a quiet seaside town on Spain's southern coast, with stone streets and the smell of salt in the air. It was Marina's first time seeing the sea. As she approached the beach, she kicked off her shoes and ran across the sand, leaving light footprints while the wind tousled her hair. Gabriel watched from a distance, his shoes still on, until she shouted, "Come on, Dad!" And in that spontaneous call, he felt his heart beat differently. He wasn't the man who reacted to events. He was someone who allowed himself to be part of them. He took off his shoes, rolled up his pant legs, and ran to her. They laughed together when the cold water surprised them. There on that deserted beach, there was no trauma, no past, no legal battles, just the two of them. A man and a girl who by chance or destiny found each other just in time. During the trip, Marina shared small wishes she'd never voiced, learning to swim, tasting seafood, falling asleep to the sound of waves. Gabriel made each happen with a simplicity that surprised him. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about being fully present. Every night before bed, she wrote one line in her notebook. "Today I was happy because," and finished with simple things like, "I ate fried squid, I found seashells," or, "He told me a funny story." Gabriel read each as if it were a prayer. It was daily confirmation that they were on the right path, even without a script. At the end of the trip, Marina tucked one of the larger shells into his pocket and said, "So you remember me, even when I grow up." He promised he wouldn't forget, and he knew it was true. Upon returning to Madrid, Gabriel felt something had changed permanently between them. The vacation had been a pause and also a confirmation. They were no longer two strangers trying to adapt. They were, in fact, a family. Marina began calling him Dad more often, even outside the home. When a teacher asked if he was her guardian, she corrected them naturally. "He's my dad." Gabriel, overhearing from afar, had to hide his surprise. He'd never asked her to call him that. He never thought he needed to. But hearing it from her mouth, with such certainty, was more powerful than any document or court ruling. It was emotional recognition, the most valuable seal of trust he could receive. That day, he bought a chocolate cake and wrote, "Our family," in his crooked handwriting on top. There was no party, no guests, just the two of them. And that was enough. Even so, some nights were still haunted by shadows. Occasionally, Marina would wake up frightened, not by Aurora herself, but by what she represented. The insecurity of losing what they'd built, the fear that it could all be taken away. One such night she asked, "When I'm not a child anymore, will you still want to stay with me?" Gabriel pulled her close, sat with her on the bed, and replied without hesitation, "I'm with you not because you're a child. I'm with you because you're you." Marina fell silent, her eyes glistening, then lay with her head on his chest and fell asleep. Gabriel stroked her hair gently and understood that no matter how much time passed, some questions would always return. His role was to answer everyone, spoken or unspoken, with presence, honesty, and patience. On Marina's birthday, Gabriel wanted something special but low-key. He knew she disliked big parties, so he planned a day just for the two of them. They started with pancakes for breakfast, visited the zoo, lunched at a restaurant with a park view, and ended the day with a movie at home, blankets on the sofa, and her favorite animated film full of music and magic. When the small cake arrived, with simple candles and a pencil-shaped topper, Gabriel sang Happy Birthday off-key, and she laughed like never before. After blowing out the candles, Marina became serious for a moment. "This was the best birthday I've ever had." Gabriel smiled, but she didn't stop there. "Before, I didn't even know I could have a day all my own." Her words struck him like lightning. He'd never considered that, for a child simply existing could feel so new. Later that night, while Gabriel washed dishes, Marina organized her gifts in her room. Among toys and books, she set aside an empty box and wrote on the lid, "Good things to remember when I'm scared." When he entered, he saw the box beside the bed already holding a few items: a colorful bracelet, the invitation to her art show, the zoo, ticket, even a napkin with his sketch of a dancing octopus. "This will help me when I'm sad or missing what we've lived," she explained. Gabriel knelt beside her, helped close the lid gently, and said, "And when you forget, I'll remind you." She smiled, held his hand, and replied, "Okay, but keep your good things too." In that moment he knew, no matter how much time passed, no matter how life changed, that bond was forever. News of Marina's case, after Aurora's final conviction, began. Circulating quietly in local media, a small regional paper published an article highlighting Gabriel's role and the impact of his complaint. At first, he wanted to avoid exposure, but Raphael convinced him that sharing their story could inspire others not to remain silent. Marina was shielded from most of the attention, and Gabriel ensured nothing disrupted her routine. Still, the coverage brought messages of support, requests for help, even similar testimonies from other families. Unwillingly, Gabriel became a reference on a topic he never imagined engaging with. Instead of shying away, he chose to get involved. With Lucia now working with him, they founded a social project focused on protecting vulnerable children. They named it House of Courage, a name Marina picked. The initiative started small, fueled by donations and hard work, but soon grew. Psychologists, educators, and volunteers joined. Even as a child, Marina frequented the center, helping organize toys, sorting art, supplies, and occasionally showing her drawings to others. Gabriel watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. He knew the project wasn't born merely of goodwill. It was born from transformed pain, and that was the lesson he wanted to teach Marina. Pain needn't define who she would become. One day, walking home together from the center, she said, "Dad, if we hadn't met, none of this would exist." Gabriel looked at her and replied, "You found me, Marina. I was just lost." She smiled in that way only she could, with her eyes before her mouth. Over time, House of Courage became part of their routine, but also a constant reminder of the story that united them. Gabriel began receiving invitations to speak at schools, companies, even legal conferences about the importance of reporting abuse and providing responsible care. Each talk was accompanied by memories that, though painful, no longer hurt as before. Marina grew, and along with her, Gabriel's capacity grew too. He was no longer the same man of cold routines and impersonal decisions. He was someone who could see people, stories, wounds, and above all, possible futures. Sometimes, seeing her asleep with a book on her chest, he remembered the first time he saw her at that sewing machine, her injured fingers and empty eyes. That image now felt distant, almost surreal. But he never forgot it, because it was that memory that gave value to all they had built since then. One spring morning, Marina appeared in the kitchen with a folded sheet of paper. "It's a school assignment. We had to write about someone who changed our life." Gabriel opened it carefully and read slowly. It began simply, "My father isn't my father by blood, but he's my real father." Throughout the paragraph, she wrote in simple, sincere words how he'd appeared suddenly, listened without judgment, and stayed even when things were hard. Gabriel tried to read to the end, but his vision blurred. Marina noticed and said, "You don't have to. Read it all now. It's in your heart, right?" He laughed, wiped his eyes, and replied, "Yes, and it will stay there." The paper was folded with care and placed in the same box of good memories, because now everything they lived was part of something you can't lose, what truly matters. One afternoon, Gabriel was surprised by a school invitation. They wanted him to participate as a parent in a parents and children event where students would share stories of overcoming challenges. Marina, who rarely got excited about school events, was thrilled. "There'll be a microphone and everything," she said, eyes shining. Gabriel hesitated. He disliked stages, much less talking about himself to strangers. But she insisted, and as always, he relented. On the day of the presentation, they sat side by side before an audience of parents, teachers, and students. When it was Marina's turn, she stood, adjusted her paper, and began. "This is the story of how my dad came into my life without knowing he was my dad." The audience smiled, but Gabriel felt his heart tighten. Marina, secure in her journey, spoke of the shop, the silences, the fears, and all that had changed. At the end, she looked at Gabriel and said, "He never promised me anything. He just stayed, and that was more than enough." The audience applauded, but Gabriel barely noticed. He stood, went to her, and hugged her tightly. In that simple school auditorium, with colorful posters on the walls and cramped chairs, he felt the cycle. Close. Not the cycle of life or care, for those never end, but the cycle of doubt. The uncertainty of doing the right thing, of being enough, of deserving such love. Marina chose him, not by obligation, but by conviction, and that was everything. Walking home that evening in silence along the now empty sidewalks, Gabriel carried her backpack on his shoulders while she held his hand. They said nothing, but inside them was a mutual certainty. Neither would ever have to walk alone again. Some nights later, Gabriel found Marina sitting on her bed, thoughtful, holding an old photo, the only one she had of her mother. "She would have liked you, you know," she said without looking away. Gabriel sat beside her, respecting the silence. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget her, but I'm also afraid of remembering too much." He understood. The memory of her mother was a bridge between what Marina had lost and what she was building. A fragile, yet sacred place. You don't have to choose. You can remember. With love, and still live new things. She won't go away because you're happy. Marina didn't respond. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that, unhurried. Gabriel didn't want to fix anything. He just wanted to be there, whole and available. And it was in that silent exchange that he realized healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves, in small moments. And that's okay. The following week, Marina returned from school with a genealogy project. She had to create a family, tree and present it. Gabriel assumed she'd feel uncomfortable, but she'd already begun drawing. She showed him the sketch. Her mother at the top alone, with a star beside her name. Below, Marina and Gabriel connected by a thick line. "I drew you strong, because we don't share blood, but we share everything else," she said. Gabriel was speechless. He ran his hand over the paper and said, "It's perfect." It was more than a school assignment. It was an effective manifesto, a portrait of all they'd built together, not based on DNA, but on presence, listening, and love. When she handed it to her teacher, she titled it at the top, "Family is who stays when no one else does." And no one could have said it better. As time went on, Marina developed a special love for writing. She filled old notebooks with short stories, blending fantasy with real memories. Gabriel adored it when she came to show a new piece, usually with, "It's not finished yet, but you can look." One day she brought something different. Instead of fairies, monsters, or underwater adventures, it was a letter. It began, "Dear future me, I hope you still remember when it all began." Gabriel read it through, his heart tight with pride. The letter spoke of fear, courage, and how, despite her small size, Marina knew how to start anew. At the end, she wrote, "And if one day I forget all this, I hope Dad will tell me again." Gabriel put the letter in a transparent folder, and that night began writing too. For the first time, a diary. He'd never kept a journal before, thinking it silly and unnecessary, but now it made sense. He began recording the day's small details, the way Marina combed her hair, the songs she hummed unconsciously, the difficult questions she asked at dinner. He wrote because memories fade, but feelings deserve to be remembered clearly, and mostly because he wanted to leave something for her to read in the future, something that said in words what he might never express perfectly aloud. Each entry ended the same way. "You changed me, Marina, and I'm better because of you." It was his way of sealing day after day the certainty that the story that began by chance was, in fact, the most important decision he'd ever made. One lazy Sunday, while they organized a bookshelf together in the hallway, Marina found an old box of Gabriel's documents, contracts, photos of properties, old business cards with his former logo. "You were so serious, huh?" she laughed. Gabriel picked up a card and stared at it. "I thought I had to be. That's how the world worked." Marina, with the lightness of someone who understands deep truths without years of experience, said, "But now you know you don't." He agreed wordlessly. His old life felt distant, not just in time, but in purpose. He had achieved almost everything he'd ever wanted, but only when he stopped seeking control and began caring for someone did he understand what truly mattered. It wasn't about having, it was about being present, available, with someone. That same day, they decided to make a photo and memory wall in the hallway between the bedrooms. Gabriel brought simple frames. Marina arranged the order. They started with a photo of them on the beach, then one from the school exhibition, the drawing of the dog on the bench, the movie ticket, even the colorful bracelet she'd received on her birthday. In the center, they placed a handwritten sheet by her. "Our story began with a shock, but became home." Gabriel read it and felt his heart warm. "You know, this isn't just your home, right?" he said. "It's your place in the world, and no one can take it away." Marina said nothing. She just rested her head on his arm and stayed there in silence. Because sometimes when security is real, words aren't needed. And at that moment, everything had been said. Months later, on a quiet afternoon returning from a routine medical checkup, Marina asked something that surprised Gabriel. "Do you think I'll forget all this when I grow up?" He looked in the rearview mirror for a few seconds before answering. "I don't know. Maybe you'll forget some details, but I think what matters most will stay." Marina seemed to ponder that. Then she said, "Promise that if I forget, you'll remind me?" Gabriel smiled gently. "I promise." And in that moment, he understood that his mission wasn't only to protect or teach, it was also to remember, to be the keeper of stories, of progress, of falls, of triumphs, to be the one who remembers, even when she cannot. Because loving, sometimes, is that keeping alive the memory of what built a heart. One night, while organizing the box of good memories with her, he found the beach shell and her first good night note, worn, faded by time, but priceless. They sat on the living room floor, laughing over crooked photos and unfinished drawings. Marina suggested, "Maybe we could write a book about all this." Gabriel chuckled, "You write it, I'll edit." But deep down he knew that book already existed, alive. Between them, in daily choices, in unspoken affection, in care without demands. It was a story without a cover or a defined end, and that was fine, because the most important thing wasn't publishing it, it was living it. A few days later, before sleep, Marina called him into her room. She was already lying down, the lamp on, eyes nearly closed. When he entered, she said, "Dad, thanks for going back to that shop that day." Gabriel's throat tightened. He sat on the edge of the bed and replied, "I didn't know, but that was where I needed to be." She smiled with half-closed eyes. "If you hadn't gone, I'd still be there." Gabriel leaned in, kissed her forehead, and said, "And I'd still be lost." She squeezed his hand, and before drifting off, whispered, Now we've found each other. In that gentle silence, Gabriel understood. Their story wasn't about rescue, it was about reunion. Two broken worlds that by chance or miracle chose to piece themselves together, and despite the scars, became something whole, true, and eternal. If this story moved you, hit the notification bell and share it with someone who'll be moved by it too.